On the night of December 6th, 1991, a fire raged inside an Austin I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop. After the blaze was put out, a grisly scene was revealed. The bodies of four girls, Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, and sisters Sarah and Jennifer Harbison, were found bound and shot in the back of the store. The shocking crime haunted the community, and the answer to the question, who shot these girls, eluded investigators. But 8 years later, four men then in their 20s, Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, Robert Springsteen, and Michael Scott, were brought in for questioning. After being interrogated for hours, Springsteen and Scott eventually told investigators they were responsible for killing the girls. Those confessions, which the men later recanted and said were made under duress, were key in leading juries to finding them both guilty, as no physical evidence ever connected them to the crimes. The convictions were ultimately overturned, and in a shocking twist, new testing revealed that the male DNA collected from the scene did not match any of the four suspects. Over 3 decades later, the murders still remain unsolved, and the families of the four girls are still without answers. Margaret Brown, director of the Yogurt Shop Murders, joins Forbes True Crime to discuss her new documentary series that reexamines the story. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, one of the hosts of Forbes True Crime. Joining me now is Margaret Brown, director of the documentary series The Yogurt Shop Murders. Margaret, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm glad to be here.
It's been over 30 years since the murders of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, and sisters Sarah and Jennifer Harbison in an I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, haunted the city. To start off the conversation, why did you decide now is the time for a series to really look at the case once again?
Well, I live in Austin most of the year, and I've been hearing about this crime for a really long time. People would talk about it at parties. It was something that came up. It was part of the fabric of the city. And I have a lot of friends in Austin who are reporters. And when I mentioned I was thinking about doing this, my best friend actually said to me that she just thought this was the most interesting crime, unsolved crime in Texas. And there were so many rabbit holes. And so I guess I was intrigued with that initially.
And you had conversations in this documentary with the family members of the victims, detectives all from different eras of this case, attorneys. I'm curious, in the beginning of the first episode of the series, you asked people who you were interviewing questions like, what drew you to the case and what does it feel like to be part of this for over 30 years? So you said that this is almost like in the fabric of the city. So what does it feel like for you now to be a thread in that fabric?
I don't know if I'm the thread, but I definitely think, it was important to me as someone who lived in Austin. I have a lot of friends that knew the girls because we're roughly the same age. And, I didn't live in Austin at that time. I moved to Austin in the late 90s. And I would say to people, I'm thinking about doing this, and they would look at me like, oh, I could never work on that, or because it just was so personal to them, So, but I did think it was good that I lived in Austin and I sort of felt the story in a way. And I was glad that someone from the outside wasn't doing it, I think.
And you could tell that everyone still felt the weight of this case, whether it be the family members, whether it be the investigators on this case. And I talked to, for an earlier podcast episode, 2 authors who wrote a book on the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. And they were the teenagers in Delphi, Indiana, who were murdered back in 2017. And they said that as the years passed from the case, it felt like the girls were, in a sense, forgotten, and the chaos of the legal challenges and things like that really took over. But watching your series, I didn't feel that way about this case. It really felt like the girls were the main focal point. Even the community said, we will not forget, repeatedly, time and time again. Even in the Austin detective's office in the Austin PD, there's still the bios of the girls with their pictures hanging up and a 3D diorama of the crime scene. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the community played such a role here?
Well, I feel like I'm part of the Austin community, and it's just something that never went away. It's something that people refer to this day in Austin. And so, I was really surprised though when I walked into the cold case unit and saw that diorama. Um, just to think that the cops every day or the investigators every day walk by that every day of their job and just it's sort of looming over them. It was pretty haunting.
It was definitely haunting, and that's not something you see a lot because normally, if there's a case that's not solved or something like that, maybe not normally, but in other cases, police want to forget about it. They don't want that. But it seems like here it's really top of mind. And within the past over 30 years, there have been so many twists and turns in this case, from false confessions to convictions to the overturning of convictions to DNA that didn't match a single suspect. Looking at this case, talking to all these people who were so heavily involved, what surprised you the most now?
I mean, I think DNA is major because when the crime happened, the two, like Jones, the lead investigator 34 years ago, and Huck, who was working with him, DNA was not something that was like top of mind. And uh, Huck and like Jones asked Huck to kind of convince the coroner to just let the bodies stay there. And if that hadn't happened, I think that DNA wouldn't be such a huge thing now because of the way the crime scene was. They thought it was a fire. At first, they didn't realize it was a murder scene. So just so much of the would be evidence was washed away. And we don't know if that was purposeful, like they set it on fire thinking, oh, the sprinklers will go off and will wash everything away. We don't know. But I think because DNA was new back then and they decided, okay, we're gonna just try this, even though it's new. I mean, thank goodness, because now we still have leads.
And then, personally, for you, how do you view your role as a director here? Because you are a fresher set of eyes here on something that people have been looking at for over 30 years. So, do you view yourself as a conduit for investigators, for the family members to tell their stories? Do you view yourself as someone who could be perhaps sharing a new perspective? What does that really look like for you?
I mean, I was really interested in two things. I mean, one, obviously, the case, like my best friend said when I started this, is really fascinating. And if you go in just with that, it's an amazing story. But it the story really changed for me when I met the families and realized like I couldn't mess this up. Like I had to do a really good job and I really felt their pain. And as someone who doesn't normally work in true crime, I mean, I think one of my first thoughts was, how do people do this over and over? It's so difficult emotionally to sit with people who are living with such unresolved pain. And I remember my first interviews were with the Ayers family, and it was just, and we did really long interviews because we didn't know if, the parents especially would be able to do another interview because it's so hard to relive that. And so, I would do these super long interviews that, as a filmmaker, I wouldn't normally do interviews that long. I would usually do sort of shorter ones and be, oh, we'll revisit that if I need to. But this was the kind of thing where I didn't know if I would get a second chance. So we did these like, for me, like super long interviews where you're just sitting with these people. And it was really, as someone who believes that you have to be kind of porous to do a good interview, you have to really sit with people wherever they are. You know, I could really, yeah, I just think it's really hard to be a true crime filmmaker for those reasons because of, what you're sort of sitting with all the time.
And you're just sitting with the grief, the unresolved grief. It's been over 30 years, and it feels like by watching this, this is still something that is not only so present with these families, but something that feels like that they can tap into this pain, and it feels like it just happened yesterday for them. And it felt like, because you talked to the victims of all, the family members of all of the victims, and it seemed like they were in different points of their grief journey, perhaps. Can you talk to us about that, A? And B, how did you get them to trust you to be the person to tell their story?
Well, I think I'll answer the second part first. And then you might have to remind me because I haven't had a lot of coffee yet. But But I think that, I joined the project after some of the team was already engaged, like the producers, and A24 and HBO had already been on the project for a while. So, um, Mickey and Beth, who were two of the executive producers, and Dave McCary, who's Emma Stone's husband, like they were all pretty involved with some of the Ayers family, at least. And so they had already had those relationships. So I walked into that with some help. With Sonora and Barbara, that was more of a process because I think they just were less inclined to do interviews and even like the heir's parents. These parents, like you sit with them and you're just like, I do not want to interview them again. With Barbara, I almost felt protective of her because I knew that whenever she does an interview, she just can't function for a really long time. I suspect it's the same with Pam Ayers. And so, you it's like hard to do your job in a way because you don't want to these mothers, and these siblings, you don't want to bring them more pain than they've already been through.
But the conversations were so important, talking to them at these various stages of their grief journey. And Sonora Thomas, the sister of Eliza Thomas, she said something really poignant. I want to share that. She shared this. There's a real benefit for both teller and audience member to telling that story and to hearing that story. I think that can change how the memory lives inside of you. And she talked about trying to keep her sister's memory alive. So, as the director of this series, essentially, what does that sentiment mean to you? And did you feel the weight of that as you were making the series?
Yes. I mean, also, it's so funny you should say that because actually, when she said that, it really sort of mirrored something that Sean Ayers, another of Amy's siblings, said as well, where there was this image that was sort of a family home video of Amy walking away from the camera in this red parka when she was doing Future Farmers of America stuff with her friends. And she's sort of looking back at the camera. And he was talking about how he's trying to hold on to the memory of her, but it keeps fading no matter what he does. And I felt like Sonora and Sean were sort of united in this like attempt to grasp this memory that's sort of slipping out of their grasp and they're fighting for ways to hold on to it. And I felt like memory was such an interesting thing that held the whole series together almost when you're looking at people's memories and how that relates to confessions and how that can be twisted somehow. But then also there's this beauty to memory of, just wanting to hold on to something that's somehow elusive. And yeah, I was really moved by both Sean and Sonora and the way they talked about that. And I really thought it was very important to include these what they said because I think it's really crucial to how we should think about this kind of crime and what it impacts on the families and siblings.
Like you said, memory played a huge role in this series, whether it be on one hand, remembering a loved one who passed away tragically. On the other hand, memory played a role in the false confessions in this case. And there was an Austin filmmaker who couldn't finish her own documentary, who that's what it was focused on. That seemed to be the theme, the false confessions of two of the people who were ultimately convicted, and then their convictions were overturned in this case. And she was going in the direction of false confessions. You were making a documentary that also focused on grief and in it seemingly in a different direction. So can you talk to us about how you pieced together footage from 2009 in the false confession direction into your larger documentary?
I mean, that footage was a gift because none of the boys, and one of whom is passed, but did not want to speak with me. We tried to reach out to them, and she had filmed them really intimately in 2009, and I became friends with Claire. I think she's an amazing human being, and often when I got stuck, I would talk to her or interview her again because in a way, like I felt like Claire's experience of feeling like really overwhelmed by a story was very similar to mine, and you could even bring that out to any filmmaker or creator because this was such a complicated story. And I mean, she hadn't even been out of school that long, and it was just her and someone making the film with her. And and I had this whole team, and I felt so bad for her because even though like she was looking to do something much more specific than I was, she was interested in like false confessions. I was interested in more about the case and grief, like I said, and memory, a different interest group. She still had she was a really good filmmaker, and I felt so bad that she became overwhelmed by it because, I had a whole team helping me with HBO and A24 and Fruit Tree and it's hard to I was like, girl, I had a whole team and you had like a few people. It's just not fair. And she's such a good filmmaker. So, but I did feel like there was something I could really relate to and that feeling of overwhelm. And there was also a sense that this story was somehow cursed. It somehow cursed everyone that touched it. It wasn't just the families that were impacted, although clearly they were impacted the most, but there was this sort of like ring of trauma around it with the way it affected Claire, the way it affected the investigators, the way it affected the city of Austin. It was a really dark story, and I felt like Claire was some I could go back to over and over and discuss this because she's such an empath and she understood, all the stakes.
And I could imagine how easy it would be to be overwhelmed by this. And especially, there was one shot, you could just see how much footage she had, right? She had multiple hard drives, she had multiple tapes. I mean, just a slew of tapes. And it could be very easy to be overwhelmed. Was that the hardest part, do you think, as a director here? Doing this or covering this story that had so much to do with trauma, had so much to do with grief. It was almost like picking a scab, not only, as you said, of the families, but really the entire city of Austin.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think when I accepted this job, I was like on the road promoting my last film, and I didn't really think about it. I thought, oh, this is a job where I can be at home in Austin. It's part of my community. I can make something that's a lot of my films are about where I'm from in the South, and I've never really made one. Well, that's not true. I have made one about Austin, but it was something I felt like, oh, I can stay at home. I don't have to be on the road all the time. And, also it pays homage to where I live. It's really important to people here. But I didn't really think about, oh my God, this is going to be, forget like all that. Like, this is going to be really hard to make for my crew that I work with all the time. This is going to bring them through this because I didn't know, because I hadn't done a story about unresolved murder and rape before. I didn't know. And I've made some really dark stories, but this was different because I know 34 years in a certain way is a long time ago, but in another way, it's really alive for these families. So I didn't really see that coming, I guess.
And that could be another one of the hardest parts, I think, for the families too, is that there's really no sense of closure. Even one of them was saying when the trials were happening, we were just almost starting our new normal in life, and now this is completely reopened. So that was just, I mean, there was so much weight to this story. So when you're talking to these families, when you're going through this evidence, when you're piecing together this series, how did your perspective change on this case from beginning to end? Because this is a case you've known about. It's almost like the ghost story of Austin.
I mean, I think it's the thing that mostly changed for me was something that happened early on. Like I realized, I thought when I first started doing it, I thought, oh, this is something. I saw the archival footage. It was really great. It really evoked a moment in time in Austin that I thought, oh, I know how to do this. Like it sort of has a David Lynchian kind of Twin Peaks feel with all the hair and this moment where Austin was sort of more of a, you know, smaller and kind of more innocent place before the tech boom. And I could hear the music in my head, like what it would sound like and how I would light it, to be kind of stylized. But then when I met the families, I was like, if I stylize it that much, it'll take away from what they're saying. You will be looking at like the sort of snazziness of the lighting, or you'll be distracted by the sound. I really have to change my focus and focus on the depth of what they're saying. So I had to pull back a lot of the stylization I was thinking of, because even though we had it, I mean, it was definitely like we had an idea of how we wanted to light it with these sort of neon backlights, and have it feel a certain way, but more subtle than I initially thought. So that was, I think, the major thing, is I realized I had to kind of slow my roll on style.
I do think you did a really good job in this series of capturing that small town feel of Austin, because that's something I was not familiar with. When I think of Austin now, I think of the podcast bros and the tech boom and those types of people moving to Austin, but it felt like a really small town back in the early 90s, and it feels like the investigators throughout this case treated they felt almost small town in the sense of, this is our community, I feel so a part of this. They were so enmeshed in this case. And even the current cold case investigator, he still thinks about this case every day. He's still working on this case every day. He thinks this is going to be solved. And there was a lot of footage of these posters that flooded Austin, of the photos of the girls, and there was the big question, who killed these girls? Do you think that that question is ever going to get answered?
Dan Jackson, who is the head of the cold case unit, he thinks that it will. Like, there's so much advancing right now in DNA technology, and he's really confident. I don't feel like I'm qualified to say. And there are things I know that I'm not allowed to say right now because it's an open investigation. So I'm hopeful, but I would never say, oh, I definitely think it's going to be solved. But I am hopeful.
And from this case, from being the director on this series, what are you taking away from this, both personally and I guess professionally as well, on your next project?
Yeah. Well, it really it made me a lot closer to my team, because I mean, I was already really close to the cinematographers, and well, the main cinematographer, and the editing team I work with, and producers, and some of the executives I've worked with repeatedly. And because it was so hard to do, I think it just brought us all a lot closer. There were times when it was just really a dark project, and there was a moment, and this is nothing compared to what the families and the investigators and Claire and a lot of people who touched this, like friends of the girls, to some extent the boys went through. We have nothing on that. However, it was really hard to be like in this sort of darkness for 3 years, and at one point, people on the team were just nightmares. A lot of the editorial team that were just like, I don't know if I can work on this anymore. And I had to go to A24 and ask for therapy for the team, because people were threatening to just not be able to work on it. And they wanted to work on it, but it was just too. But on the other hand, there were people who were working on this project, um, who there were personal reasons why they did want to work on it, because of some unresolved trauma in their life around something like this. And so I just think it was a very powerful sort of world, and we all had to stick together to get through it. And I'm very thankful that A24 like helped us with therapy, because it's kind of a thing that's happening in film now for films that are in war-torn countries, and also I think things that just deal with deep trauma, where therapy is a line item in the budget, but we really needed it. It was something that was, I don't think we would have made it through.
That's a really forward thinking way, because I've never heard of therapy being demanded like that. And I think that that's a really great thing, because you're just dealing and grappling with so much trauma, unresolved trauma. And it doesn't seem like, from what you're saying, that it looks like this is going to get solved anytime soon. Do you have a theory
I don't
of
know
what
that.
happened?
I don't know that. I don't know that it's not going to get solved anytime soon. I think if you want to talk about that, you should call the cold case unit, because I can't talk to that really specifically, but I would never say it's not going to get solved anytime soon.
Okay. From that point, I know you can't talk about that then. Do you think, do you have a theory at least of what you think happened?
Don't have a theory. I mean, I mean, this is something there's like a text chain on our crew where everyone has a theory because that's what's so interesting about this case is because I could I could tell you a bunch of theories, but I don't have a theory, you know? I think,
Mhm.
um, I do think that whoever did it, um, you know, I think it's sort of a complex crime, and it seems like they thought it out in advance to me, just from what I can tell. But yeah, it's just such a black hole in a way. But I do think with DNA, that's the best chance we have to solve it.
And we're certainly going to keep our eyes out for any developments on this case. And all 4 episodes of the Yogurt Shop Murders are available now. Where can people watch?
It's on HBO Max in the States and, in other countries, I think in the UK it's on Sky, but mostly it's on HBO throughout the world.
Margaret Brown, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much for the conversation. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much, and the questions were great. Thank you for making me think.